Jelith's office occupied the coldest section of Veska Station, where the environmental systems prioritized Kithran physiology over human comfort. She preferred it that way. The chill kept her thoracic plates properly contracted, her neural pathways operating at optimal efficiency. 18 cycles of protocol administration had taught her that efficiency was the only ethical response to catastrophe. She ran her secondary manipulator across the data tablet, reviewing the morning's intake assessments. 3 new human participants scheduled for compatibility screening, 2 follow-up consultations, 1 disciplinary review, a Tholis applicant who'd become emotionally volatile during matching procedures, a common response to prolonged sterility. She flagged it for psychological intervention and moved to the next file. The gesture was automatic. Everything about her work had become automatic, which was precisely how it should be. The winnowing didn't pause for sentiment. The genetic mathematics didn't care about individual preferences. Her role was to facilitate the intersection of biological necessity and willing participation, to maintain the machinery that kept 300 systems from sliding into extinction. She was exceptionally good at it. Her comm terminal chimed, Administrator Velketh requesting her presence at the morning briefing. She stood, her locomotor segments articulating in the precise rhythm she'd perfected during military service, before the winnowing had reassigned every competent Kethran from warfare to survival logistics. The transition had been seamless for her. She'd simply redirected the same disciplined efficiency toward a different form of preservation. The briefing room held the usual assemblage: medical directors, psychological counselors, genetic compatibility specialists. Velketh, massive even for a Tholis, occupied the central platform, his reabsorption scars visible along his thorax, where his body had begun consuming itself in the absence of viable reproduction. He'd survived the process, but something essential had hollowed out behind his optical sensors. "Commander Jelith," he said, his translator rendering the chemical signals into flat standard. "Your efficiency reports continue to exceed quotas. The consortium has noted Veska's integration success rate." She acknowledged with the proper gesture of professional satisfaction. The praise meant nothing. Exceeding quotas was simply correct execution of established protocols. "However," Velketh continued, "we've received a priority placement. Human participant, xenobiology specialist, compatibility indices we've never recorded before. The genetic modeling suggests crossover potential with 7 species. He's already in transit." Jelith accessed the file on her tablet. Dr. Elias Cade, Earth Colony Kepler 442, 31 standard years. The compatibility data made her pause, not from emotion but from pure mathematical improbability. His genetic profile formed connections across biological kingdoms that shouldn't theoretically interface. "When does he arrive?" she asked. 6 hours. I want you to conduct the intake interview personally." It was unusual. Jelith typically delegated first interviews to junior administrators, but the compatibility ratings justified the exception. A resource this valuable required careful handling. "Understood," she said. The rest of the briefing blurred into routine updates. Jelith's attention remained on Cade's file, analyzing the data with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything. High empathy indices, ethically rigorous to the point of self-sabotage, background in cross-species biological communication, published research on adaptive genetic plasticity, useful qualifications for protocol integration, nothing more. She returned to her office and spent the next 4 hours processing standard administrative functions, approved 6 genetic matching proposals, reviewed 3 psychological intervention reports, updated resource allocation for the medical wing's human-compatible environmental controls. The work filled the time between briefing and interview with familiar efficiency. When the notification arrived that Cade had completed station orientation and was waiting in interview room 7, Jelith gathered the standard intake documentation and made her way through Veska's corridors with the same precise locomotion she'd used for 18 cycles. The interview room maintained neutral environmental settings, a compromised temperature that left humans slightly cold and Kethrans slightly warm. She entered, data tablet in her primary manipulator, and found him already seated. The first thing she noticed was his hands. He was shaping something in the air between them, fingers moving in small, precise gestures that seemed to trace invisible structures. The movement stopped when she entered, but the awareness remained. He held his hands carefully now, consciously still, as though he'd just realized the habit and was attempting to contain it. Her neural interface flagged the behavior as anxiety displacement. The assessment was clinically accurate and completely insufficient. "Dr. Cade," she said, settling into the seat across from him. "I'm Commander Jelith. I'll be conducting your intake assessment. Thank you for meeting with me." His voice carried something the translator couldn't quite render, a quality underneath the words that made her aware of the temperature differential between them. His organic heat, radiating across the metal table. She initiated the standard questionnaire. He answered each question with precision that matched her own. Yes, he understood the commitment duration. Yes, he'd reviewed the psychological impact documentation. Yes, he was aware that genetic contribution protocols would be determined by compatibility, matching, and medical necessity. His responses were textbook perfect. But she found herself watching his hands again, the way they wanted to move and didn't, the restraint he was exercising over his own body. "Do you have any reservations about protocol participation?" The standard question, designed to identify psychological contraindications. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up, not at her rank insignia, not at the tablet between them, but directly at her face. His eyes met her compound visual senses with a steadiness that suggested he was seeing past the chitinous plating to whatever existed beneath. "I think everyone has reservations about being necessary instead of wanted," he said. "But necessity is something, isn't it? It's a form of mattering." The words landed differently than they should have. His expression when he said them, weary, clear-eyed, almost gentle in its resignation, created a resonance in her thoracic cavity that her biological monitors immediately flagged. Irregular cardiac rhythm, non-emergency classification. She noted the physiological response with clinical detachment and continued the interview, asked the remaining standard questions, explained the next phases of integration, provided the documentation he'd need to review before compatibility matching began. He listened with the same careful attention, his hands finally still. When the interview concluded, she stood. He stood. The protocol required she escort new participants to their assigned quarters personally, a gesture meant to establish administrative accessibility. She led him through Veskar's corridors, maintaining the appropriate professional distance. "The station will feel cold initially," she said. "Human physiology requires several cycles to acclimate to Kethran environmental standards. Your quarters have supplemental thermal regulation." "I appreciate that." He walked beside her, his gait adapting to her different locomotion pattern without apparent effort. "How long have you been administering the protocols?" 18 cycles. That's... He paused, seemed to calculate the conversion. "A long time to carry this kind of responsibility." The observation was inappropriate. Personal. She should have redirected the conversation to procedural matters. Instead, she found herself answering. Responsibility implies alternatives. The winnowing didn't offer those. She felt his attention sharpen, the same quality from the interview, that sense of being seen rather than catalogued. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it didn't." They reached his quarters. She provided the access codes, explained the environmental controls, indicated the communication terminal for administrative requests. Professional, efficient, exactly as she'd done for hundreds of participants before him. "Thank you, Commander," he said. She turned to leave. Her neural interface flagged another cardiac irregularity. She ignored it and returned to her office, where she spent the remainder of the cycle processing standard administrative functions with perfect efficiency. That night, alone in her quarters, she accessed his file again. The pattern established itself over the following cycles with disturbing ease. Jelith told herself she was monitoring a high-value participant. Cade's compatibility ratings justified additional administrative oversight. The genetic modeling continued generating unprecedented crossover potential. 17 applicants in the first compatibility wave alone, each representing a species whose continuation depended on successful integration. She processed his file last in every queue, extended his adjustment period beyond standard duration, reassigned 3 compatible applicants to other human participants with lower ratings but adequate genetic overlap. The justifications were technically sound. Resource optimization, strategic reservation for critical cases, long-term protocol efficacy. She documented each decision with proper administrative reasoning, and no one questioned her judgment. She'd earned 18 cycles of trust. She didn't examine why she routed her station inspections past the residential wing where he'd been assigned quarters, why she attended the xenobiology integration lectures he'd volunteered to provide, despite having no administrative reason to be there, why she found herself aware of his presence in communal spaces with a specificity that had nothing to do with her official responsibilities. He was adapting well. The reports from psychological counseling indicated healthy adjustment. He'd established cordial relationships with other human participants, participated in the station's research programs, maintained his xenobiology work alongside protocol obligations. She watched him in the commissary sometimes, from the administrative observation deck that overlooked the communal areas. He ate alone, usually, though he was never isolated. Other humans would join him, drawn by something she couldn't quantify. He'd gesture with those precise hands, shaping concepts while he spoke, and they'd lean in, listening with attention that suggested he was offering something beyond casual conversation. She told herself she was assessing social integration patterns, monitoring participant well-being, maintaining administrative awareness. The lie was efficient, which made it easy to sustain. 3 cycles after his arrival, Velketh summoned her to review Cade's compatibility queue. 17 applicants had become 23. The genetic mathematics were compelling. Each match offered viable crossover potential that could stabilize entire genetic lines. "We should begin integration proceedings," Velketh said. "The priority cases have been waiting long enough." Jelith reviewed the files with clinical precision, found procedural justifications for additional delays, compatibility verification protocols, extended psychological preparation, optimal integration timing based on participant adjustment indices. Velketh's reabsorption scars seemed to darken. "Commander, I appreciate thoroughness, but we're operating under winnowing urgency. Every cycle we delay represents potential complications if we rush integration with a participant this valuable," she interrupted. "His compatibility ratings are unprecedented. We cannot afford procedural errors." The logic was sound. Velketh approved her timeline extensions. She returned to her office and accessed Cade's file again, reading his research publications, his personal statement, the psychological evaluations that described him as ethically rigorous and possessing unusually high empathy indices. She told herself she was preparing for optimal integration management. The medical bay summoned her 4 cycles later for a routine consultation she should have delegated to junior staff. She went anyway. The examination room maintained the same neutral environmental compromise as the interview space. Cade sat on the platform, wearing the thermal regulation suit all humans required in Kithran standards. The material clung to his organic form, making the heat differential between their biologies visually explicit. Jelith explained the next phase of protocol integration with her usual clinical efficiency: compatibility matching procedures, genetic contribution protocols, medical monitoring requirements. Her voice remained steady, professional, exactly calibrated. While she spoke, she noticed he was watching her hands, the same way she'd watched his in that first interview. His attention had that same quality, learning something beyond the words. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you ever regret it? Building a system this efficient?" The question should have been inappropriate, should have triggered documentation protocols for participant psychological intervention. The boundary violation was clear. Instead, she found herself answering, "Regret implies alternatives. The winnowing didn't offer those." "No," he agreed quietly. "I suppose it didn't." The silence that followed carried physical weight. She became aware of how close she was standing to the examination platform, how the heat differential between their biologies created a microclimate in the narrow space, how his breathing, automatic, constant, evidence of the chemical volatility that made his species so genetically crucial, had altered its rhythm. She should have stepped back, should have concluded the consultation. Her manipulators remained still. Why did you really volunteer? The question emerged before she could apply proper professional filter. His expression shifted into something that looked like relief at being asked. Because being useful is better than being irrelevant. Because I'd rather participate in my own commodification than pretend it isn't happening. Because... He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. Because if this is inevitable, I'd prefer to choose it. The honesty was devastating in its precision. She understood, with sudden clarity that bypassed all her careful professional distance, that she had not chosen him for resource optimization. She had claimed him, had used administrative authority to keep him in proximity while constructing elaborate justifications, had become the exact architecture of necessity he'd just described, a system that couldn't distinguish between wanting and needing, between preservation and possession. Her cardiac monitors registered sustained irregularity. The protocols will continue, she said, her voice losing some of its professional calibration. Your compatibility queue is significant. The integration proceedings can't be delayed much longer, he finished. I know. He did know. She could see it in the way he held himself on the examination platform, the careful stillness that suggested he'd been aware of her administrative manipulations from the beginning, that he'd understood what she was doing and why, and had simply waited. I should conclude this consultation, she said. Yes, he agreed. Neither of them moved. The heat differential between them felt like proximity, like the space before an airlock opened, like something inevitable approaching at exactly the speed the mathematics predicted. Finally, she stepped back, gathered the medical documentation, provided the standard post-consultation instructions. Her voice had returned to clinical efficiency, but something underneath had fractured. When she left the medical bay, the station's environmental systems flagged elevated heat signatures in the examination room. The genetic matching algorithms, indifferent to everything except biological mathematics, continued highlighting his file in 23 ongoing applications. She returned to her quarters and accessed his file again. 23 species waiting for continuation, for hope, for the specific gift his adaptable biology offered. The mathematics were absolute. The necessity was non-negotiable, but she sat in her cold quarters, her cardiac monitors showing sustained irregularity, and understood that she was no longer implementing the system. She was trapped inside it, wanting something the universe had forgotten how to give freely. Not genetic material or biological continuity, but the simple, impossible luxury of choosing connection over function. Of mattering to someone beyond what her body or his could provide. And he'd just confirmed that he understood that deprivation with the same aching clarity, which made everything exponentially more complicated and utterly unsustainable. The administrative hold couldn't last indefinitely. Jelith knew this with the same certainty she knew the winnowing's mathematics. But knowing and accepting occupied different territories of consciousness. She began appearing in spaces where Cade worked, the xenobiology lab, where he'd requested research access, the observation deck during his scheduled exercise periods in the human-compatible environmental zone, the archive section where he spent hours reviewing consortium biological databases. She told herself it was participant monitoring, enhanced oversight for high-value cases, but the justifications were becoming transparent even to her own rigorous self-assessment. He never seemed surprised by her presence. The first time she entered the xenobiology lab during his research hours, he simply looked up from the microscopy array and said, "Commander, did you need something?" "Routine inspection," she said. "Of course." He returned to his work. She should have conducted the inspection and left. Instead, she found herself moving closer to the array, watching what he was examining. Cellular structures from a Ivaresh sample, the silicate formations that had simply stopped replicating 3 generations prior. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. Even in its ending, she looked at the crystalline patterns, the geometric perfection of systems shutting down. Beauty is inefficient. Maybe that's why it matters. He adjusted the magnification, bringing the structures into sharper focus. Efficiency is about survival. Beauty is about something else. His hand moved near hers on the array controls, not touching, close enough that she could feel the heat differential. She left the lab without completing the inspection, but she returned the next cycle. and the one after that. The pattern shifted from administrative oversight to something neither of them named. He would be working, she would arrive, they would occupy the same space without procedural justification. Sometimes they spoke. Often they didn't. She began to recognize the small calibrations he made to accommodate her presence. How he adjusted the lab's environmental controls, slightly cooler when she entered, knowing her Kethran physiology preferred the chill. How he positioned himself at the arrays so there was space for her to observe without crowding. How his hands stopped their anxious shaping when she was near, as though her presence provided the containment he'd been seeking. The realization should have prompted professional distance. Instead, she found herself making reciprocal calibrations, scheduling her station rounds to coincide with his research hours, bringing technical documentation he'd requested from restricted archives, adjusting the lab's resource allocations to extend his access privileges. Small gestures, administratively defensible, emotionally transparent. He never acknowledged them directly, but she noticed the way his shoulders would relax fractionally when she entered the lab, the way his breathing would even out, as though something that had been held taut could finally release. 3 cycles into this unsustainable pattern, he asked. Do you have preferred environmental settings? For your quarters, I mean. The question was personal, inappropriate. She should have redirected to procedural topics. Cold, she said instead. As cold as the environmental systems allow. He nodded, his attention still on the microscopy array. It's the opposite for us. Humans, I mean. We generate too much heat, always trying to shed it. I've noticed. The admission hung between them. She had noticed, had catalogued the way his body radiated thermal energy, had become aware of it with a specificity that violated every principle of professional detachment. Does it bother you? He asked. The heat differential? No. The truth of it surprised her. The temperature difference that should have been merely biological had become something else. A constant, tangible reminder that they occupied fundamentally different categories of existence, that the space between them was measured in more than physical distance. He looked at her then, fully, the way he had in that first interview. It doesn't bother me either. The cold, I mean. They held the look for a duration that exceeded professional parameters. Then he returned to his work, and she completed the inspection she'd never actually intended to conduct. That night, alone in her quarters, her cardiac monitors showed irregularities that had stopped being non-emergency classifications. Her neural interface suggested medical consultation. She dismissed the recommendation and accessed Cade's file again, reading research publications she'd already memorized, looking for something the data couldn't provide. The breaking point arrived with bureaucratic inevitability. Velketh summoned her to his office with formal protocol markers that indicated non-negotiable directives. She arrived with proper professional composure, already constructing defenses for administrative decisions she knew were indefensible. Commander Jelith, Velketh said, his reabsorption scars darker than she'd seen them. We need to discuss Dr. Cade's integration timeline. She accessed the relevant files on her tablet, reviewing data she'd already analyzed countless times. The compatibility verifications have required extended processing for 6 cycles beyond standard protocols, Velketh interrupted. I've reviewed your documentation. The justifications are technically sound. They're also transparent. The accusation hung in the office's cold air. I'm ensuring optimal integration, Jelith said, her voice maintaining clinical efficiency, even as something underneath began fracturing. His compatibility ratings are unprecedented. We cannot afford the luxury of individual preference, Velketh said, and the exhaustion in his chemical signals bypassed the translator's flattening effect. 23 species are waiting. Each cycle we delay represents genetic lines that move closer to termination. You know this. She did know. The mathematics were absolute. You're relieved of Dr. Cade's case management, Velketh continued. Administrator Telshira will assume responsibility for his integration proceedings. Compatibility matching will begin next cycle. The directive was reasonable, procedurally justified. Exactly what should have happened 6 cycles ago, before she'd allowed personal compromise to contaminate professional function. Understood, she said. Velketh's optical sensors held hers. I'm not reprimanding you, Commander. You've maintained exceptional performance for 18 cycles. but you're demonstrating attachment patterns that compromise protocol efficacy. I'm recommending a mandatory rest cycle and psychological consultation. That's unnecessary. It's required. You're dismissed." She left his office with the same precise locomotion she'd used to enter, but something in her thoracic cavity had destabilized. Her cardiac monitors registered readings that exceeded irregularity into actual dysfunction. She returned to her quarters and stood in the coldest section, letting the chill contract her plates, seeking the efficiency of proper physiological function. Her neural interface chimed, an urgent message from the medical bay. "Doctor." Cade had requested consultation, not with Telshira, with her. The request violated the case reassignment. She should have forwarded it to appropriate channels. Instead, she found herself moving through Veska's corridors toward the medical bay, her locomotion patterns abandoning precision for speed. He was waiting in the same examination room where the necessary question had been asked, still wearing the thermal regulation suit, still radiating that organic heat into the neutral environmental compromise. "You requested consultation," she said, her voice stripped of professional calibration. "They told me about the case reassignment." He stood from the examination platform. Telshira came to explain integration procedures, very efficient, very clinical. "That's appropriate." "Yes." He moved closer, not quite crossing professional distance, but approaching its boundary. "Very appropriate." Her cardiac monitors were screaming warnings. She ignored them. "The integration proceedings will begin next cycle," she said. 23 compatible applicants. The protocols require—" "I know what the protocols require," he said quietly. "I've known since the first interview, since you started delaying the inevitable while pretending it was resource optimization. The acknowledgement should have generated shame. Instead, it created something close to relief." "I violated professional parameters," she said. "Yes." "The reassignment was necessary." "Yes." "The mathematics are absolute." "Yes," he agreed. "Then, but they don't account for everything, do they?" She understood what he was asking, whether the space between them, the accumulated small calibrations, the unsustainable pattern of proximity, the wanting that couldn't be quantified, whether any of it mattered against the absolute necessity of survival mathematics. "No," she said. "They don't account for everything." He closed the remaining distance, not touching, close enough that the heat differential became a shared microclimate, a physics demonstration of their fundamental incompatibility. "I don't want to be necessary," he said. "I want to be chosen, but the universe doesn't offer that luxury anymore." Her manipulator moved without conscious direction, extending toward his hand. He met the gesture, his fingers settling against her chitinous plating with a gentleness that suggested he knew exactly how alien the contact was and accepted it anyway. The touch lasted 3 seconds, long enough for her cardiac monitors to register catastrophic irregularity, long enough for his breathing to alter rhythm, long enough for both of them to understand that the mathematics had stopped being theoretical. Then she stepped back, and he let her. "The integration proceedings will begin next cycle," she repeated. "I know. Administrator Telshira is highly competent." "I'm sure she is. This is the appropriate outcome." "Yes," he said. "It is." But neither of them moved toward the door. Jalith spent her mandatory rest cycle in her quarters, declining all communication except emergency administrative channels. Her neural interface continued suggesting medical consultation for cardiac irregularities. She continued dismissing the recommendations. On the second rest cycle, she accessed Cade's file and discovered Telshira had begun integration proceedings with procedural efficiency. First compatibility match scheduled in 4 cycles. Medical preparations underway. Psychological counseling sessions logged. Everything was progressing exactly as the protocols required. She should have felt relief. Instead, she experienced something her neural interface couldn't classify, a hollowing sensation in her thoracic cavity that had nothing to do with Kethran physiology and everything to do with the space where wanting and necessity had collided and created unsustainable outcomes. Her comm terminal chimed, not an administrative summons, a personal message from Cade. She stared at the notification for an entire cycle before accessing it. "Commander Jalith," the message began, formal and proper. "I wanted to thank you for your administration during my initial integration period. Your guidance was invaluable. The transition to Administrator Telshira's management has been smooth, and I'm proceeding with integration protocols as scheduled. I've continued the xenobiology research you facilitated access to. The Ivaresh cellular analysis has produced some interesting findings about genetic crystallization patterns. I'd welcome your professional perspective if you have time. The lab environmental controls remain optimized to your preferred settings. The message was procedurally appropriate, entirely professional, and completely transparent. She read it 17 times. Then she violated mandatory rest protocols and made her way to the xenobiology lab. He was there, as she'd known he would be, working at the microscopy array in a space cooled to Kethran comfort levels. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression suggested he'd been counting cycles. "Commander," he said, "thank you for coming. You mentioned research findings." "Yes." He gestured to the array. "The Ivaresh crystallization. There's a pattern I wanted your analysis on." She moved to the array, examining the cellular structures with clinical precision. The pattern was interesting, academically notable, absolutely not worth violating rest protocols to consult on. They both knew it. "Your assessment is sound," she said after appropriate analysis duration. "The crystallization follows predicted genetic narrowing trajectories." "That's what I thought." He adjusted the magnification. His hand moved near hers on the controls. "Beautiful even in its ending." "You said that before." "Did I?" "Yes." His fingers shifted fractionally closer. Not touching. The heat differential created visible condensation on the cold metal surface between them. "The first integration session is in 4 cycles, he said quietly. "Telshira explained the procedures, very thorough. She's competent." "Yes." A pause. "Do you ever wonder what the protocols would look like if we still had the luxury of choice?" The question was inappropriate, emotionally loaded. Exactly what her mandatory rest was supposed to help her process, with proper professional distance. "Choice is inefficient," she said. "Necessity provides clarity." "Does it?" His attention remained on the array, but she felt the weight of the question. "Or does it just make the absence of choice easier to accept?" Her manipulator moved without authorization, settling against his hand on the control surface. His fingers didn't pull away. Instead, they shifted, finding spaces between her chitinous plating, creating contact that was gentle and deliberate, and utterly catastrophic to professional boundaries. "This is inappropriate," she said. "Yes. The protocols require—" "I know what they require." "Then why—" "Because," he said, and his voice carried something the translator couldn't flatten, "I'd rather have 4 cycles of choosing you than a lifetime of being necessary to everyone else." The admission created silence that felt like pressure changes, like environmental systems failing, like the physics of their incompatibility made suddenly, impossibly irrelevant. Her neural interface was screaming warnings. Her cardiac monitors showed readings that required immediate medical intervention. The rational, professional, procedurally correct response was to terminate this interaction and report for psychological evaluation. Instead, she turned toward him, her compound eyes meeting his human ones, and said what 18 cycles of flawless administration had never permitted. "I don't want to be the system anymore." His expression shifted into something that looked like recognition, like relief, like he'd been waiting for her to articulate what they'd both been circling. "Then don't be," he said quietly. "Not here. Not for the next 4 cycles." The proposition was clear. 4 cycles before integration proceedings began. 4 cycles outside the mathematics. A small, impossible luxury of chosen proximity instead of administered necessity. Every principle she'd maintained for 18 cycles demanded she refuse. "The lab," she said instead, "maintains optimal environmental parameters." His fingers tightened against her plating. "It does. And the research requires extended analysis." "Significant analysis," he agreed. 4 cycles should be sufficient." "Should be," he said. Neither of them moved toward the door. They remained at the array, his warmth and her cold creating a shared microclimate, their hands maintaining contact that violated every professional boundary, while the universe outside continued its inexorable slide toward genetic termination. And for 4 cycles, Jelith decided, she would let it. The first cycle, They maintained the pretense of research. Jelith arrived at the lab during hours when station traffic was minimal. Cade would already be there, the environmental controls optimized to that precise temperature compromise they'd discovered together. They would stand at the microscopy array, examining cellular structures, discussing genetic crystallization patterns, maintaining professional distance, until they didn't. It happened in small calibrations, his hand settling near hers on the controls. Her manipulator shifting incrementally closer, the space between them compressing through accumulated proximity until contact became inevitable, natural, and then constant. The second cycle, they stopped pretending. She entered the lab and found him at the array, but he'd abandoned the microscopy work. Instead, he'd accessed the environmental control interface, studying the parameters with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "I've been mapping the temperature differentials," he said without preamble. "Between your optimal settings and mine, there's a narrow range where we're both comfortable, about 3 degrees. That's remarkably precise. I'm good with systems." He looked at her fully. "When I'm motivated to understand them." She moved to the interface, examining his calculations. They were accurate, meticulous. A quantification of the space where their fundamentally incompatible biologies could coexist. 3 degrees is insufficient for long-term viability, she said. "I know." His voice was quiet. "But it's enough for now." Now. The word carried weight, an acknowledgement of temporality, of the 4 cycles counting down toward inevitability. 2 already consumed, 2 remaining. She adjusted the environmental controls to the precise midpoint of his calculations. The lab's atmosphere shifted, and something in her thoracic cavity eased, while something in his shoulders relaxed. "Better?" she asked. "Better." They stood in that 3-degree compromise, and she understood what he'd been mapping. Not just temperature, but the narrow range where wanting and necessity intersected, where choice existed, however briefly. His hand found hers without hesitation this time. His fingers traced the edges of her plating, learning the topology of her difference with a gentleness that suggested reverence rather than clinical curiosity. "Does this hurt?" he asked. "No." "Does it feel like anything?" She considered the question with the same precision she'd once applied to protocol administration. His touch registered through sensory receptors designed to detect environmental threats, structural damage, chemical changes. It shouldn't have translated to anything beyond basic physical awareness, but it did. "Yes," she said. "It feels like something." His fingers continued their exploration, finding the seams between plates, the softer tissue underneath, the places where Catherine physiology transitioned from rigid protection to vulnerable function. She remained still, letting him learn, understanding that this was its own form of research, a mapping of the impossible. When his touch reached the thoracic cavity where her cardiac irregularities originated, she felt him pause. "Your heart," he said quietly. "I can feel it. The rhythm's wrong." "I know." "How long?" "Since the first interview." He met her eyes, his expression holding something too complex for translation. "Mine too." The admission created a silence that felt like shared catastrophe. They were both failing at basic physiological regulation, their bodies refusing to maintain the efficiency their respective biologies required, and neither of them seemed capable of stopping it. She shifted her manipulator, settling it against his chest where she could feel the organic heat concentrated, where his cardiac system operated with that chemical volatility that made humans simultaneously vital and fragile. His breathing altered. Not distress, something else. "Jelith," he said, using her name without rank for the first time. The translator rendered it awkwardly, but the intimacy underneath was clear. "Elias," she responded, testing the shape of his designation without professional buffer. His hand covered her manipulator, pressing it closer to his chest. She felt his heart accelerating beneath her touch, felt the way his whole body responded to proximity with a transparency that Catherine physiology didn't permit. "I need you to understand something," he said. "When the integration proceedings begin, when I'm fulfilling protocol requirements with those 23 species waiting, it won't be this. It won't be choice. It won't matter the way this matters." She knew what he was offering, a distinction between biological function and emotional significance, a way to separate the necessary from the wanted, even when both involved the same physical intimacy. "The mathematics don't allow for that distinction," she said. "No," he agreed, "but we do." His thumb traced the seam of her plating, and she felt her thoracic cavity respond with sensations her neural interface couldn't classify. Want, need, the collapse of the boundary between them. She leaned closer, bringing her face near his, understanding that this was as close to a kiss as their incompatible biologies allowed. This shared breathing space, this mingling of his warmth and her chill, this deliberate choice to occupy the same impossible moment. "2 cycles," she said. "2 cycles," he confirmed. And they remained there, in their 3-degree compromise, mapping each other's impossible geography while the station continued its efficient administration of survival outside the lab's sealed door. The 3rd cycle, they barely spoke. Jelith arrived at the lab to find Elias had reconfigured the entire space. The microscopy arrays had been pushed to the periphery. The environmental controls were set to their discovered optimum. The lighting had been dimmed to levels that accommodated both compound and human vision. He'd created a space for them. Deliberate, temporary, precious. She understood immediately that this was how he processed endings, by making them matter, by refusing to let necessity erase significance. "1 cycle left," he said when she entered. Not a question, an acknowledgement. "Yes." He moved toward her with the same careful attention he'd shown since the beginning. But something had shifted. The hesitation was gone. They were past the point of pretending this was anything other than what it was. Catastrophic, unsustainable, chosen. His hands found her plating without preamble, tracing paths they'd mapped together. She responded in kind, her manipulators learning the topology of his shoulders, his neck, the places where human warmth concentrated beneath skin that seemed impossibly vulnerable without chitinous protection. They moved together across the lab, not toward any specific destination, just maintaining contact while the 3-degree compromise kept them both viable. His back found the wall eventually, and she pressed closer, feeling the way his body heat intensified with proximity, the way his breathing became something she could almost taste. "Show me," he said quietly. "Show me what you feel. I know Kethrans don't have the same emotional expressions, but show me anyway." She understood what he was asking, a translation of her internal catastrophe into something his human neurology could recognize, an impossible request that she found herself attempting anyway. Her manipulators settled against his face, careful not to damage the soft tissue. She could feel the muscle movements beneath his skin, the micro-expressions that conveyed what his species used in place of chemical signals. She tried to mirror them through touch, through the pressure of her plating against his warmth, through the way she allowed her thoracic cavity to resonate against his chest. "I feel," she attempted, the translator struggling with concepts that didn't fit Kethran linguistic structures, "like the system is collapsing and I don't want to maintain it anymore. Like efficiency was armor and you've made it obsolete. Like 18 cycles of perfect administration were preparation for this catastrophic failure of professional function." His hands tightened on her plating. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me. It's highly inefficient. I know." His mouth curved, that expression humans used for pleasure, for pain, for the collapse of the boundary between them. That's why it matters. She understood then what he'd been trying to teach her since the first interview, that the universe's forgetting of freely given connection was its own catastrophe, separate from the winnowing's biological mathematics. That necessity and choice weren't synonyms, that she'd been administering survival while starving for significance. They remained against the wall, their bodies maintaining the contact that kept them both functional in their 3-degree compromise. His breathing settled into a rhythm that matched her cardiac irregularities. The synchronization should have been physiologically impossible. Their biologies operated on completely different chemical and mechanical principles. But their bodies had stopped consulting the mathematics. "Tomorrow," she said, the temporal marker carrying finality. "Integration proceedings begin." "I know." 23 species waiting. "I know." "The protocols require—" He stopped her with a gesture, his hand covering her vocal apparatus with impossible gentleness. "I know what they require, and I'll fulfill them, because necessity is absolute, and I made the choice to participate." "But this—" His hand moved to her thoracic cavity, pressing against the source of her cardiac chaos. This isn't protocol compliance. This is the only choice that's actually mine. She felt something in her internal structure destabilize completely. 18 cycles of containment fracturing under the weight of wanting something the universe no longer offered freely. "I don't know how to survive this," she said. "Neither do I." His forehead pressed against her plating, his warmth against her chill, creating condensation that felt like physics crying. "But we have one more cycle to fail at figuring it out." They spent the remaining hours mapping each other with desperate precision, learning the geography of their impossible connection, storing sensory data that would have to sustain them through whatever came after. His hands found every seam in her plating. Her manipulators learned the rhythm of his pulse, the places where his warmth concentrated, the way his body responded to touch with a transparency that Kithran biology didn't permit. When she finally left the lab, the station's environmental systems flagged catastrophic temperature irregularities. Her neural interface recommended immediate medical intervention for cardiac dysfunction. The genetic matching algorithms continued their indifferent calculations, highlighting Elias's file in 23 ongoing applications. She ignored all of it and returned to her quarters, where she spent the final cycle before integration proceedings trying to remember how to be the system instead of a person trapped inside it. Administrator Telshira conducted the first integration session with flawless efficiency. Jelith monitored from her office through the standard documentation protocols, reviewing the medical reports, the compatibility confirmations, the psychological counseling notes. Everything was proceeding exactly as the protocols required. Elias Cade was fulfilling his role as biological bridge with the same competent precision he'd brought to his xenobiology research. The first compatible applicant, a Ivaresh scientist whose species had ceased reproduction 4 generations prior, reported successful genetic integration. The second session showed similar efficacy. The third exceeded projected compatibility thresholds. The mathematics were absolute. The necessity was non-negotiable. The system was functioning with optimal efficiency. Jelith's cardiac monitors registered readings that her neural interface classified as critical dysfunction, requiring immediate intervention. She dismissed the recommendations and continued processing administrative functions with professional detachment that was becoming harder to maintain with each cycle. On the 4th integration session, her comm terminal chimed. A personal message from Elias, routed through proper channels, copied to Telshira for documentation compliance. "Commander Jelith," it began, formal and procedurally correct. "I wanted to inform you that the integration proceedings are progressing well. Administrator Telshira has been exceptionally competent in managing the protocols. I've continued the xenobiology research during off-session hours. The lab environmental controls remain optimized to preferred settings. The 3-degree compromise is holding. I thought you'd want to know that the necessity is sustainable. The wanting is not. But I suspect you already understood that. The mathematics don't account for everything, but we do." She read the message once, then archived it in a personal file that violated data management protocols. That night, she found herself in the xenobiology lab, despite having no administrative justification. The space was empty, the environmental controls still set to their discovered optimum, the microscopy arrays positioned where Elias had moved them during their final cycle together. She stood in the 3-degree compromise and felt her thoracic cavity resonate with absence. Her neural interface chimed. An urgent summons from the medical bay. Elias had requested emergency consultation, with her specifically. The request violated case reassignment protocols. Telshira should have been contacted. She was moving through the corridors before rational thought could intervene. He was waiting in the examination room, still wearing the thermal regulation suit from his most recent integration session. His biological readings were normal. His psychological evaluation showed acceptable adjustment metrics. "You requested emergency consultation," she said, her voice stripped to essential function. "I lied." He stood from the examination platform. "There's no emergency. I just needed to see you." The violation was clear, unambiguous. Grounds for removal from her administrative position. "This is inappropriate," she said. "Yes, the protocols are proceeding exactly as designed," he finished. I'm fulfilling my function. 23 species are getting what they need. The mathematics are absolute. But I needed you to know that it doesn't feel like choice anymore. It just feels like what I agreed to before I understood what I was trading. She understood what he was confessing. The distinction he'd offered in the lab, between biological function and emotional significance, was collapsing under the weight of continuous integration sessions. That fulfilling protocol requirements with 23 compatible applicants was erasing the space where wanting had existed separately from necessity. "What do you need?" she asked. "I don't know." His hands moved in those anxious patterns from their first interview, shaping invisible structures. "I just know that when I'm in integration sessions, I'm performing competence. But when I was with you in the lab, I was choosing connection, and I don't know how to sustain both." She crossed the examination room, abandoning professional distance completely. Her manipulators found his hands, stilling the anxious movement, providing the containment he'd been seeking. "The integration proceedings will continue," she said. "The mathematics are absolute. I know. But this—" She pressed her plating against his chest, feeling the cardiac irregularity that matched hers. "This remains separate." How? The question carried exhaustion, desperation, the cost of trying to maintain boundaries the universe no longer permitted. How do we keep it separate when the protocols require the same physical intimacy? She didn't have an answer. The mathematics offered no distinction between biological function and emotional significance. The protocols treated all genetic contribution as equivalent, necessary, divorced from choice. But they'd created something in the lab that refused those parameters, had discovered a 3-degree compromise where their incompatible biologies could coexist, had chosen connection over function, significance over necessity, wanting over needing. And she understood with devastating clarity that maintaining that distinction would require constant, exhausting, possibly unsustainable effort. "We fail at it," she said finally. "We fail at keeping it separate. We let it matter too much and cost too much and hurt too much, and we choose it anyway." His arms came around her plating, holding her with the same impossible gentleness he'd shown in the lab. She felt him trembling, that human physical response to emotional overload that Catherine physiology didn't produce. "I don't know if I can do this for the full protocol duration," he said against her shoulder. 18 cycles of integration sessions, while maintaining this impossible distinction. "I'm not that competent." "Neither am I." The admission created silence that felt like shared catastrophe. They were both failing at the efficiency the system required, both choosing significance over survival mathematics, both understanding that the cost would be catastrophic and choosing it anyway. "What do we do?" he asked. She held him in the examination room, their 3-degree compromise creating a microclimate of impossible viability, and told him the truth. "I don't know." The fracture began with a routine administrative review. Velketh summoned Jelith to his office 6 cycles into Elias's integration proceedings. She arrived with professional composure that was becoming more performance than reality. "Commander," Velketh said, his reabsorption scars nearly black with stress, "we have a situation." She accessed the files he transmitted, already knowing what they would contain. Documentation of unauthorized consultations, environmental control modifications in the xenobiology lab, personal communications that violated case reassignment protocols, a pattern of boundary violations spanning multiple cycles. "Dr. Cade has requested transfer to a different station," Velketh continued. "He's citing psychological complications with continued integration proceedings at Veskar. Administrator Telshira has endorsed the transfer as therapeutically indicated." The information created silence that felt like atmospheric failure. "When?" Jelith managed. 3 cycles. "He'll complete his current integration queue and then transfer to Station Cathara 7 for continued protocol participation. The transfer is approved, non-negotiable." She understood immediately what Elias had done, had recognized the unsustainability of their impossible distinction and chosen separation as the only viable solution. Had requested transfer not because integration proceedings were failing, the documentation showed exceptional compatibility outcomes, but because proximity was destroying them both. "I see," she said. "Commander, I need to ask." Velketh's chemical signals carried something that bypassed the translator's flattening, concern perhaps, or recognition. What happened? She could have lied, could have claimed professional objectivity, could have maintained the performance of efficiency she'd perfected over 18 cycles. "I wanted something the system doesn't allow," she said instead, "and he was willing to fail at sustainability to give it to me." Velketh was quiet. Then, "The protocols don't account for that." "No, but you do." "Yes." He seemed to consider this. "I'm not reprimanding you, Commander. You've maintained protocol efficacy despite personal compromise. But I am requiring that you do not contact Dr. Cade during his final 3 cycles at Veska. No consultations, no communication, no proximity. He's made the choice that serves his long-term protocol participation. You need to let him." The directive was reasonable, procedurally sound, absolutely devastating. "Understood," she said. She returned to her office and spent the next cycle processing administrative functions with mechanical precision. Approved integration matches, reviewed compatibility reports, updated resource allocations. The work continued with perfect efficiency, but her neural interface registered cardiac dysfunction that exceeded critical thresholds, and she understood that she was no longer implementing the system. She was being destroyed by it. That night she violated Velketh's direct order and sent one message to Elias's personal terminal. The 3-degree compromise remains. She didn't expect a response, but one arrived within the cycle. It always will. 3 cycles passed with administrative inevitability. Gelith maintained professional distance. Elias completed his integration queue with exceptional efficacy. The transfer preparations proceeded exactly as scheduled. On his final day at Veska, she found herself in the xenobiology lab despite explicit orders to maintain separation. The space was exactly as they'd left it. Microscopy arrays at the periphery, environmental controls set to their discovered optimum, lighting dimmed to accommodate both their visual systems. The 3-degree compromise was holding. She stood in the empty lab, her cardiac monitors screaming warnings she continued to ignore, and understood that this was how connections ended in a universe that had forgotten how to give them freely, not with resolution or closure, but with the simple, catastrophic reality of separation in service of survival mathematics. Her comm terminal chimed. Elias's transport had departed for Station Cathara 7. The notification should have provided relief. The unsustainable situation was resolved. The protocol efficacy was preserved. The mathematics would continue their indifferent calculations without personal compromise complicating the equations. Instead, she experienced something her neural interface had no classification for, a hollowing in her thoracic cavity that felt like the inverse of wanting, like the absence of significance, like the cost of efficiency finally made explicit. She left the lab without adjusting the environmental controls and returned to her quarters, where she spent the next cycle failing to remember how to be the system she'd maintained with flawless competence for 18 cycles. Until one message destroyed what remained of her professional distance. The message arrived from Station Cathara 7, 4 cycles after Elias's transfer. Administrator Felkris requesting urgent consultation regarding Dr. Elias Cade's protocol participation. Psychological complications. Integration efficacy declining. Immediate intervention recommended. Gelith read the attached documentation with clinical precision that was becoming harder to maintain. Elias was fulfilling his integration sessions with technical competence, but his psychological evaluations showed deteriorating adjustment metrics, increased anxiety indices, emotional withdrawal, somatic symptoms suggesting systemic stress. The counselor's assessment was clear. Continued protocol participation at current intensity levels would result in catastrophic psychological breakdown within 2 cycles. Recommended intervention. Temporary suspension of integration proceedings for comprehensive psychological rehabilitation. The recommendation violated everything the winnowing's mathematics required. His compatibility ratings were too valuable to suspend. 23 species at Veskar alone were waiting for his genetic contribution. Station Cathara 7 had generated 17 additional compatible matches, 40 species depending on one human's continued participation. The mathematics were absolute, but the human was failing. Jelith's comm terminal chimed again, Velketh requesting her immediate presence. She arrived at his office to find Administrator Felkris present via communication link, their insectoid features displaying stress markers that transcended species barriers. "Commander Jelith," Felkris began without preamble, "Dr. Cade has requested direct communication with you. Multiple times. We've denied the requests per your station commander's directive, but his psychological state is deteriorating rapidly. The counselors believe the denial is exacerbating his distress." Velketh's reabsorption scars were nearly invisible, a sign of severe stress in Kethran physiology. "Commander, I need your professional assessment. Would direct communication serve protocol efficacy or compromise it further?" She understood what he was actually asking, whether the connection she'd formed with Elias was therapeutic or destructive, whether proximity served survival or destroyed it. "Permission to speak candidly," she said. "Granted. Dr. Cade and I formed an attachment that violated professional parameters. The attachment was consensual, emotionally significant, and utterly unsustainable within protocol requirements. His transfer was the appropriate response. But the mathematics that make his participation necessary don't account for the psychological cost of continuous genetic contribution while maintaining emotional separation from the one connection he chose rather than accepted as necessary." Silence followed. Then Felkris said quietly, "The protocols don't have provisions for that." "No," Jelith agreed. "They don't." "What do you recommend?" Velketh asked. She accessed Elias's psychological evaluations, his integration efficacy reports, the medical documentation that showed a human body fulfilling biological function while its emotional systems collapsed. She thought about their 3-degree compromise, about the impossible geography they'd mapped together, about the distinction between being necessary and being chosen, and she made the decision that would cost her 18 cycles of flawless administration. "Transfer him back to Veska," she said. "Suspend his integration proceedings for 2 cycles. Allow direct communication and supervised proximity. I'll take administrative responsibility for managing his psychological rehabilitation while maintaining protocol efficacy." "Commander, that's—" Velketh stopped, recalibrated. "That's requesting permission to sustain the exact attachment that created the initial complications." "Yes. The mathematics require his continued genetic contribution. We can't afford extended suspension. The mathematics also require his psychological viability," she countered. "A catastrophic breakdown will terminate his protocol participation permanently. 2 cycles of rehabilitation serves long-term efficacy better than immediate continuation toward inevitable failure." Velketh exchanged some untranslatable communication with Felkris. Then, "You understand, this will be documented, that your professional objectivity will be permanently compromised, that you're requesting to maintain the exact situation that violated protocol parameters." "I understand." "Why?" The question was simple. The answer was catastrophic. "Because," Jelith said, feeling 18 cycles of containment finally fracture completely, "the universe forgot how to give connection freely. But I haven't forgotten how to choose it. And he's failing because he's trying to survive a system that treats chosen connection and biological necessity as identical. I can't change the system, but I can acknowledge the distinction. I can witness that it matters, even if the mathematics don't account for it." The silence that followed felt like the pressure before an airlock opened. Finally, Velketh said, "Transfer approved. 2 cycles rehabilitation. You'll maintain full administrative oversight with daily progress documentation. And Commander, this is your final exception. The next violation will result in removal from protocol administration." "Understood." She returned to her office and sent one message to Station Cathara 7. "Transfer approved. You're coming home." His response arrived within the cycle. "Home. Yes." And Jelith understood that she'd just chosen personal significance over professional integrity, connection over efficiency, the impossible luxury of wanting over the absolute mathematics of necessity. The cost would be catastrophic. She chose it anyway. Elias arrived at Veskar with documentation that made the cost explicit: significant weight loss, elevated stress hormones, sleep disruption, cardiac irregularities that matched Jelith's own dysfunction. The human body, pushed beyond sustainable parameters, was consuming itself. She met him at the docking port despite protocol suggesting administrative delegation. He stepped off the transport wearing the same thermal regulation suit, but the fit was wrong now. Too loose where his body had depleted itself, trying to maintain impossible distinctions. His eyes found hers immediately. No words, just recognition. She led him through Veska's corridors to the medical bay, where comprehensive rehabilitation protocols waited. The counselors had prepared intervention strategies. The medical staff had nutritional supplementation ready. Everything was designed for optimal recovery. But when they reached the examination room, Elias said quietly, "Can we go to the lab first?" It violated the rehabilitation schedule. The counselors would document the deviation. But she understood what he needed wasn't medical intervention. It was confirmation that the 3-degree compromise still existed. They walked to the xenobiology lab. She keyed the access code. The door opened on the space exactly as they'd left it, cycles ago. Environmental controls at their discovered optimum, lighting dimmed, microscopy arrays positioned at the periphery. Elias stepped inside, and immediately his shoulders released tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. His breathing evened out. The stress markers that had been visible in his posture softened. "It's still here," he said. "It never left." He turned to face her fully. "I tried to maintain the distinction at Cathara 7, between biological function and chosen connection, between necessary and wanted. But integration sessions there felt like..." He stopped, started again. Like every session was erasing the memory of what choosing felt like, until I couldn't remember why the distinction mattered. She moved closer, her manipulators finding his hands with the ease of practiced geography. "The rehabilitation protocols are designed to restore that distinction. Are they?" His expression held exhaustion that went beyond physical depletion. "Or are they designed to make me functional enough to continue integration proceedings without catastrophic breakdown?" The question was devastatingly precise. "Both," she admitted. "The protocols require your continued participation. But I require that you survive it as something more than biological function." His hands tightened on her plating. "What if those requirements are incompatible?" She didn't have an answer. The mathematics offered no compromise between survival necessity and psychological viability. The system didn't account for humans who needed chosen connection to remain functional while performing necessary biological contribution. "Then we fail at one of them," she said finally. "We choose which failure we can survive." He leaned his forehead against her plating, his warmth against her chill, creating their familiar condensation. "I don't want to fail at choosing you." "Then don't." "But the mathematics..." "Don't account for everything," she finished. "We do." They remained in the lab for the duration that rehabilitation protocols allocated for initial orientation. Then she escorted him to his reassigned quarters, the same residential wing, the same environmental specifications, but with enhanced medical monitoring to track his recovery. Over the following cycles, they developed a new pattern. Mornings, medical consultations, nutritional supplementation, physical rehabilitation. Afternoons, psychological counseling, stress management protocols, integration preparation. Evenings, the lab, where they maintained their 3-degree compromise and practiced the impossible distinction between necessary and chosen. Gel-Ith documented everything with clinical precision. The counselors noted improved psychological metrics. The medical staff reported steady physical recovery. His integration efficacy projections returned to optimal levels. But in the lab, away from documentation protocols, they practiced something the system couldn't quantify. He would map her plating with gentle precision, learning the places where stress created microfractures, where cardiac irregularities manifested as structural strain. She would hold him while his body remembered how to maintain itself, providing the containment that medical interventions couldn't. They didn't speak about what would happen when rehabilitation ended. When integration proceedings would resume with the same mathematics, the same necessity, the same 23 species waiting at Veska alone, until the final cycle of rehabilitation, when the counselors declared him psychologically cleared for protocol resumption. That night in the lab, Elias said what they'd both been avoiding. "I'm not strong enough to maintain the distinction indefinitely. Integration proceedings will eventually erase the space where this exists." She felt her thoracic cavity contract with something her neural interface couldn't classify. I know. The mathematics are absolute. Yes. But I don't want necessity to be all that's left. She understood then what he was asking, not for a solution, they both knew the protocols offered none, but for witnessing, for acknowledgement that the distinction mattered even as the system erased it, that he would continue because survival required it, but that continuation came at a cost the mathematics didn't account for. It won't be, she said, pressing her plating against his chest, because I'll remember. When you're fulfilling protocol requirements and the distinction becomes impossible to maintain, I'll remember that you chose this first, that for a small, impossible duration, you weren't just necessary, you were wanted. His arms came around her plating with desperate strength. Promise me. I promise. Even when I can't remember it myself, even when integration proceedings erase the boundary between necessary and chosen, promise you'll remember. I will. They held each other in the 3-degree compromise while the rehabilitation cycle expired, and tomorrow approached with administrative inevitability. And Zelith understood that this was the only resolution the universe still offered. Not solutions, not escapes, but the simple act of witnessing that the cost mattered. That connection chosen freely was different from connection administered as necessity, even when the physical intimacy remained identical. The mathematics couldn't account for it, but she would. Integration proceedings resumed with the efficiency Zelith had maintained for 18 cycles. Elias fulfilled his protocol requirements with the same competence that had made him invaluable. 23 species at Veskar, 17 more identified through expanded compatibility modeling. His genetic contribution continued stabilizing populations across 40 biological kingdoms. The mathematics were absolute. The necessity was non-negotiable. The system functioned with optimal efficacy. And every evening, when integration sessions concluded and administrative functions were complete, they met in the xenobiology lab. The pattern became ritual. He would arrive first, adjusting the environmental controls to their discovered optimum. She would join him when station traffic diminished. They would spend the allocated time mapping the geography of their impossible connection, maintaining the 3-degree compromise that kept them both viable. The counselors documented it as therapeutic maintenance. The medical staff noted improved stress metrics. Velketh approved the pattern as serving long-term protocol efficacy. No one acknowledged what it actually was, a sustained rebellion against the universe's forgetting, a refusal to let necessity erase significance, a daily choice to maintain a distinction the mathematics didn't permit. Cycles became seasons. Seasons became years. Elias's integration sessions continued with exceptional outcomes. His body stabilized at the new baseline, leaner, marked by the sustained stress of continuous contribution, but functional. His psychological evaluations showed adaptation rather than deterioration. He was surviving it. Barely, but surviving. And every evening, Zelith witnessed that survival came at a cost. She noticed the small changes. How his hands moved less when he spoke, as though the anxiety displacement had been subsumed by something else. How his shoulders carried permanent tension that their evening sessions could ease but never eliminate. How his eyes held an exhaustion that went beyond physical depletion. The integration proceedings were succeeding, but they were slowly consuming the distinction he'd been trying to maintain. 3 years into the resumed proceedings, he said quietly in the lab, I can't always remember anymore. Which sessions are necessary and which are chosen? They're starting to feel the same. She felt her thoracic cavity contract. I remember. Tell me. You chose this first, she said, settling her plating against his chest, where his heart still carried irregularities that matched hers. Before the integration cue, before the mathematics became absolute, you chose proximity over efficiency, connection over function. You made wanting separate from needing, even when the universe had forgotten how. His breathing evened out. You promised you'd remember. I did. I do. He held her with the same impossible gentleness, but she could feel the difference now, the way continuous protocol participation was eroding his capacity to distinguish between biological function and emotional significance. The system was succeeding at its purpose, maintaining his genetic contribution while slowly erasing the space where choice existed. She was watching him become what the protocols required: necessary, functional, depleted of everything except the biological gift the mathematics valued. And she understood that this was the actual cost, not the integration sessions themselves, but the sustained erosion of the boundary between chosen and necessary. The slow transformation of a person into a resource, even while that person tried desperately to maintain the distinction. "Jelith," he said, using her name without rank the way he only did in the lab. "If I forget completely, if the distinction becomes impossible to maintain, will you still choose this?" The question was asking whether she'd sustain their evening pattern even when it stopped serving any function except witnessing, when he could no longer remember why it mattered, when the mathematics had consumed everything except the physical fact of proximity. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She pressed closer, their 3-degree compromise creating the microclimate that kept them both viable. "Because the universe forgot how to give connection freely. But I haven't forgotten that it matters, even if the mathematics don't account for it, even if the system erases your memory of choosing it, even if all that's left is my witnessing that once, briefly, you weren't just necessary. You were wanted." His arms tightened around her plating. She felt his heart against her thoracic cavity, the rhythm that had been irregular since their first interview, the proof that they were both failing at basic physiological regulation. And she understood that this was the only victory the universe still offered. Not resolution, not escape, not even survival intact, but the simple, devastating act of continuing to choose significance even as the system worked to erase it, of maintaining a 3-degree compromise in a universe that had narrowed to binary mathematics, of witnessing that the cost mattered, even when the person paying it could no longer remember why. The integration proceedings would continue. Elias would fulfill protocol requirements until his body or mind finally depleted beyond recovery. 40 species would receive the genetic gift his adaptable biology offered, and the mathematics would record it as optimal resource utilization. But in the lab, in their 3-degree compromise, Jelith would remember what the system couldn't quantify, that he had chosen her first. That necessity and wanting weren't synonyms. That connection freely given was different from biological function, administered as survival, even when the physical intimacy remained identical. She would remember for both of them. And she would continue choosing him every evening, in the small, impossible space between necessary and wanted, until the mathematics consumed everything except the act of witnessing itself. It was inefficient, unsustainable, catastrophic to every principle she'd maintained for 18 cycles. She chose it anyway, because in a universe that had forgotten how to give connection freely, the act of choosing, however doomed, however costly, however ultimately futile, was the only rebellion that mattered, the only luxury that couldn't be administered, calculated, or consumed, the only thing that remained precious precisely because it refused to be necessary. And in the lab, in their 3-degree compromise, they sustained it together. A fragile, impossible distinction between surviving and mattering, between biological function and chosen connection, between the mathematics that demanded continuation and the humanity that demanded significance. It wouldn't last forever. The system would eventually consume it completely. But for now, in this cycle and the next and the one after that, they chose each other across the impossible distance between their incompatible biologies. And that choice, however temporary, however doomed, made them something more than resources. It made them witnesses to each other's humanity. And in a universe breeding itself into extinction, that witnessing was the only form of continuation that actually mattered.